Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to have you all with us today. I'm Vinika Rao, Executive Director of the INSEAD Gender Initiative. I see that our participant numbers for the webinar are increasing rapidly. Hopefully, we will have everyone ready with us in the next few minutes. Among our registered participants today, we have INSEAD alumni and current students, students from other schools, business leaders and executives, and academics. A very warm welcome to you all. The topic of today's discussion is, will the COVID-19 disruption develop or dismantle gender balance? Every day, we're seeing new evidence of the impact that COVID-19 is having on lives and livelihoods across the globe. As government and business leaders struggle to ensure the survival of their nations and companies, it is easy to overlook the less obvious but highly insidious effect that COVID-19 is having on gender balance. But early evidence does suggest that the pandemic is having a disproportionately negative impact on women across the world. So can we avoid having COVID-19 disrupt the hard-earned progress towards creating a more gender-balanced society and workplace? Are there any steps that we can take today to ensure that we are poised for post-COVID recovery with a balanced and diverse workforce? These are some of the issues that we will be talking about today. I want to welcome our speakers for today. We have with us Professor Zoe Kinias, who's the Academic Director of INSEAD's Gender Initiative and Area Chair and Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at INSEAD. Zoe will be sharing some very interesting research on the topic. I'm also very happy to welcome a special guest today, Derek Lutton. So Derek is one of our own and INSEAD MBA alum. He's also on the executive committee of the INSEAD Global Women in Business Club and a very strong supporter of our gender initiative. I should mention that in his day job, Derek is also Managing Director of Levant Capital Management. Pleasure to have you with us today, Derek. And now over to you, Zoe, to present your research.
Thank you so much, Vinika. It's my pleasure to be here with you all today. It's evening here in Singapore. I know it's afternoon in Europe, and maybe we have some folks from the Americas in the morning as well. Very happy to have you all here. If we could get the slides back up, please. Thank you. And you can go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. So quite early on in the disruption, I started getting questions about how the COVID-19 disruption was impacting gender balance on a global level. And like you all, I'm sure, I was watching the media reports that were suggesting the negative impact that Vinika was talking about a moment ago. So as I was watching these reports come out, and being asked the questions, I kept thinking, I would like to have better answers to the questions, not only stopping with what is the impact, but also what can we do to systematically improve the situation and to use the disruption in a manner that enables us to leverage it rather than be pushed back and really just forced into a darker time with respect to gender balance and gender equity. So thinking along these lines, if you could advance to the next slide, please. I had been starting to develop thinking about wanting to learn more from the collective wisdom of our INSEAD alumni and our community more broadly, when I had a conversation with Liana, who is another wonderful supporter. She is one of our Global Women in Business Club leaders and really been a wonderful partner for us before the disruption. And when we were talking about this, I had shared the idea that I was interested in starting to get the input of the collective wisdom of our group. And she said, yes, let's do it. And so it was really a co-creation of the survey results that I'll be sharing with you that that gave birth to the ideas that I'll be sharing. And I want to start by sharing with you, if you could advance to the next slide, please. The first thing that we wanted to learn from our respondents, who were our alumni mostly, but also other business leaders and some other community members as well, is how they saw, how did you see gender balance now relative to before COVID-19? And what we see here is that the majority of people who responded said that it was either slightly worse or much worse now than before the disruption began. So this is the quantitative indication of what's happening. But it's also very important for us to understand what people were observing and what people were experiencing that is the impetus for this perspective. If you could advance to the next slide, please. Here, what we see popping, and this is a word cloud that's generated as a result of how many times different words are mentioned. We take out the boring words like the and it, of course. And what we see popping very strongly here are these couple of dimensions of work and home are the ones that are coming up most strongly. And there's this strong tension between these. We also see family, children, school, care, caring for others, managing household with jobs, and this tension between these factors was very prominent in what people were observing and sharing with us in those reports. So this is an important feature of what folks were sharing with us, which is consistent largely with what we've been seeing in the media reports as well, and some of the other early research. We could advance to the next slide, please. Oh, did you want to ask something, Vinika?
I was going to, yes. Just before we move on to the next slide, could you tell us a little bit about the respondents who took the survey so we have a sense of the demographic markup?
Absolutely, very happy to share with you. So we had 290 complete responses. So this is folks that answered all of the questions. We were about 2/3 female, so a good response from men, but also a little more than half female. We also had a nice representation from different generations. So we had 25% were millennial, a little more than half were Generation X, and then the rest were baby boomers and members of older generation. We had a very large representation. Remember, these are largely INSEAD alumni. So because we have such senior leaders as a part of our alumni representation through the school, we had 44% of our respondents were either in C-suites or general management roles. So we have a lot of leaders' views, which is very important for us to keep in mind. We sometimes have larger surveys that we draw data from, but because there are so many of our respondents are in these senior roles, that helps to add a bit of richness and depth to what was shared. More than half of the responders were MBA alums, but also many from our executive degree programs and other senior leadership programs. And again, as I mentioned, some from the community more broadly. So thank you for asking, Vinika, giving me that opportunity to tell you a little bit more about that before I move on. And now if we could go ahead and advance. Oh, you've already advanced me, thank you. So what gets interesting with respect to the responses is the slide that we're showing now is focusing on what our respondents said would be happening in the future. How will gender balance be in the future relative to how things were before the COVID-19 disruption? And what's so interesting to me in this slide is not the fact that if you just average, people say basically no change. It's the fact that we had relatively few people saying no change, and the vast majority of people saying either it will be better or it will be worse. So this pulling apart, we statistics nerds, if there's anybody who fondly remembers their statistics classes, we call this a bimodal distribution, which means there's not very many in the middle and more on both sides of the distribution. So this gets interesting for us. To unpack what's going on with respect to this spread of distribution, if we could advance to the next slide, please. We'll look next at what the folks who were anticipating things being better said specifically. And here we see that there was a real focus on flexible work, that remote and flexible work would be beneficial, presumably for women, right? So this idea that what we've been lacking historically, and one of the things that's been very challenging for women's career progression, and this is true, we know that this has been a challenge, is that at the life stage where families have young children and there is a tension between career progression and childcare, that in most societies and in many families, those child rearing responsibilities fall more heavily on the shoulders of women. And so given that context, the flexibility should substantially help the development of gender balance within our organizations. Now, if we could advance to the next slide, please. What's interesting to look at here is that the respondents who said they thought things would be worse after the disruption were also thinking about some similar factors. We see childcare, home responsibilities, and flexibility are also listed here. But what we see is different is the fact that this is considering more how there is, schools are out, maybe schools won't return to normal. Will there be childcare available in the same way that there was before? What will happen with this transition back to a new normal? And what will that new normal really look like? And the potential that there will be more traditional style need for someone being at home with children than there has been in the past few decades is part of the concern. So what I find very interesting about the previous slide and this one taken together is this idea that we're considering quite similar factors, but seeing them in a different way. It's a different framing of the similar constructs. So we seem to be in agreement that these are issues that are very important for us to be thinking about and considering, given the disruption and the co-creation of a new normal amongst ourselves and with the other leaders with whom we collaborate.
Indeed.
Now,
Zoe,
yes,
sorry.
please.
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
Would you like to take an audience question now? There's one that's quite
Sure.
relevant.
Yes, please, please.
Okay, so there's a question that's asking about, so were the respondents citing tensions between work and home as a major pain point of COVID now?
Yes, yes. So that is one of the most significant pain points now. There were also mentions of some other concerns. So there were some folks who were paying attention to issues such as increased domestic violence. So this is something that we've seen on a global level. There were also some folks paying attention to the layoffs and the categories of work and the fact that women are more likely to be employed, because we know due to gender labor segregation that men and women on average do different types of jobs. And so the types of jobs that women do, we've noticed in early economic reporting, are more likely to be out of work due to lockdowns, so having to be home. Things like food and beverage jobs, which women disproportionately hold, have just been shut in many countries. So these types of, this is another element that folks were reporting on. But the big one, and you see that popping with these word clouds, were about the childcare responsibilities. Should we carry on? Oh, go ahead.
Well, another very interesting question, just before I let you carry on, if you don't mind. So, when you're talking about those people who are talking about some of the positives and expecting that perhaps the future will actually be better, there's a question around flexible working, that while it seems like flexible working will make things better in the future, it can also have negative career repercussions. Will that persist post-COVID?
That's really a great question. I have many times wished that I had a crystal ball through which I could see into the future these days with, so there's so much uncertainty. I think it has potential to be revised. Our mental models of what it means, like is the profile who works remotely, I think is potentially up for revision. So this could indeed be a benefit of the current disruption. But time will tell what really happens with respect to these challenges. Now, to the extent that people who are working from home, and this will be men and women, of course, who choose to work more flexible hours, or their organizations set themselves up in such a way that there is less face-to-face in-office work. What will be critically important is that there are still good relationships among the workers, that the people have opportunities to develop their networks, to interact with each other as human beings. And so these will be the really essential elements. My own personal perspective is that ideally we'll be able to introduce more flexibility that is optional, that is sort of more encouraged and more mainstream within our organizations. But at the same time, there will also be an opportunity for people to connect in real working environments, to enable the humanization of our work, to learn from each other more, and so forth. We'll talk about some of those suggestions more towards the end of my presentation as well, but really glad you asked that question. Okay, so we'll carry on now. And the next thing that I wanted to share with you was, what are our respondents doing, or how much are our respondents contributing to the development of gender balance, given we are clearly at this inflection point? The fact that things are disrupted now enables us to have some ability to create a new future from the disruption we're in. So we wanted to know how much are people contributing. And what you see here is that 69% of our respondents are doing a moderate amount or more with respect to contributing to the development of gender balance, which is great news for us. Now, of course, in my scientist hat, I must admit that this is probably a biased sample. We did not randomly sample the population of people everywhere in the world, but among our community, the folks that we are collaborating with and who are responding to the survey, we see really substantial contribution. So this is great news for us. And if you could advance to the next slide, please. The next question that we were interested in asking, and this is where we need to be able to look at the survey responses and how they are correlated with each other. It starts to get quite interesting when we look at who is contributing more now during the disruption. The first thing of note is that our older respondents are contributing more, which is quite interesting. Now, this could be that folks have more time on their hands, the children are grown already, there's more time to be contributing to societal benefits, which is a fascinating trend that we do see in other samples of surveys as well. So wanted to thank our folks who are a little bit later in their life progress that are doing so much. This is great to see. And another point that's really interesting is that we thought that there would be a relationship between seeing a negative impact of COVID-19 on balance now or in the future, that these factors would predict the extent to which people are contributing to gender balance. And that was not the case. So it seems that there's diversity of perspectives about what's happening, but people are still contributing to the development of gender balance based on factors that they would have before the disruption. So this is something we find quite interesting. Another point of note is that our male and female respondents are contributing at the same level. So it's not the fact that women are disproportionately contributing to this. So this is another interesting finding and something that we're quite happy to see, that there is gender balance in our contribution to gender balance among our community. We always like to see that. Happening. And then the final point that I wanted to share with you here is that those who see themselves as social impact leaders were contributing substantially more to the development and the maintenance of gender balance. And this is something that we have been investigating quite a bit in the last couple of years. So if you could advance to the next slide, I want to share a bit more with you about this. What we've been studying now for some time is the fact that although we see the SDG number 5 of gender equality embedded among the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and many of our organizations frame their gender equality or their gender diversity initiatives under this umbrella of societal benefit more broadly. We as research scholars tend not to pay that much attention to this relationship and how this embedding works. So we've been very excited. I've been doing this research with Clarissa Cortland, and what we've been looking at and finding very reliably across lots of different samples and lots of different research methodologies is that the extent to which people see themselves self-identify as social impact leaders is a strong predictor of the extent to which they contribute to the development and maintenance of gender balance. We found this in 4 large surveys with our INSEAD MBAs, our INSEAD alumni. We've used US online samples, and we've also conducted a survey within the European region in a large multinational chemical company. So we see this reliably in our surveys. We've also done an experiment in the United States where we randomly assign people to either think about themselves as social impact leaders or not, and then we measure the extent to which they want to contribute to the development of gender balance. And we've also looked at this in a large multinational bank's Asia Pacific regional office, looking at the extent to which people had been encouraged to and then subsequently did connect with their identity as a social impact leader, and the extent to which they subsequently participated in that organization's gender diversity initiative, their events, and contributing to that discussion within that, that bank. And now we also see this again during the COVID-19 disruption. So we find this very interesting, and it's a finding that as I mentioned before, this is not something different than what we were seeing before the COVID-19 disruption, but it's something that's reliably and robustly coming through in our data here. So I wanted to share that with you and highlight it for you. And this can be, as a result of the reliable research findings that we've been getting, a potential way for us to start to engage more people in the conversation with respect to the development or of working towards gender balance by talking about these sustainable development goals and other societal benefits more broadly, to engage a broader community who therefore starts to think more seriously and to contribute more to the development and maintenance. And I could talk about this research all night, but I want us to be able to move on to more conversation. So if you could, oh, do you have a question, Vinika, before we move on?
I do indeed, Zoe. We had a couple of short ones, which I think perhaps, I can ask you quickly now. Just one quick question on any geographical patterns in the data that you noticed? Or was this more or less for?
So because we just closed the survey very recently, we've not had time to thoroughly analyze, but that is on our to-do list. And we will let you know as soon as we find out. Ben Kessler is our wonderful knowledge editor, and he's already committed to helping us write that up once we have more time to analyze the data more carefully with respect to that, because there's lots of ways you can look by continent, by level of already established gender inequality, et cetera. So we want to really look at those data carefully before we conclude whether there are differences or not. Thanks for asking.
And there's another question which I suspect your next slide is answering anyway, but the question is about, given that you had so many leaders, senior leaders, as you mentioned, among the responders to the survey, what are they telling you that they are doing at this time during COVID-19, which is impactful to counteract the negative effect?
Absolutely, that's exactly where we were headed. So we asked 2 questions that speak to this in slightly different ways. So the first question we asked is, we asked people, what are you doing? So we asked, how much are you doing? And then we said, tell us more qualitatively about what you're doing. And what we see here is what popped from those responses. A lot of providing support, helping, giving their time, talking about the situation, working with their teams, mentoring, these types of activities really popped from the responses that we got. And then thinking a bit more on this, so what you actually asked, Vinika, is the next slide, which is on what do our business leaders suggest? And for this slide, what I put here is not only what people are doing, but what specifically are the business leaders among our respondents. So these are the people who are in the C-suite or general management roles within their organizations. And what we see here is not so different from what we had in the previous slide. Providing support for others is a big one. But there are also some other points that pop for me that I'd like to share with you. And so we have these, the thinking about flexibility, the thinking about family situations, and we also have evidence that they're thinking about policies within their organizations. And there's also this word, it's not the biggest one up on the list, but if you look at the top of the Wordle, you see the word look. And this look, when you look more carefully at the responses, what people typed out, we see that people are talking about being inquisitive, getting organized, ensuring that we are including the input of the people within our organizations. And although there's so much to do, people have busy schedules and feel very crunched for time, that it is critically important not to make these decisions in an entirely top-down way, but to make sure that we're also learning from within our organization. Which brings me to the last slide that I wanted to share with you, is I wanted to elaborate a little bit more on what we know from best practices with respect to leading change towards the development of gender balance that we can all be practicing as we consider the challenges that we're facing and what we can most effectively do. And the first point that I wanted to share with you is that we need to continue to consider the complexity of the situation. Jennifer Petriglieri and I talk about the systemic web of challenges in a knowledge article that we'll share with you after. And the idea behind this approach is that we don't have a single silver bullet that will solve all problems with respect to gender balance. And so we really need to be thoughtful about this, to carefully appraise the situations that we're in and what are the particular challenges that people are facing. So although there's been a lot of focus in what our leaders were sharing, and also what's been in the broader media about parenting being one of the big challenges, that is not going to be the only challenge that comes out of this disruption. And so we need to be mindful that there are lots of men and women who don't have small children at home. That's not the issue for them. There can be other situations that are arising for folks. And so we need to not just assume that that's the one thing, and if we fix that, everything will be resolved. The second point I wanted to share with you is that building a learning culture is critically important, particularly now. And this is something that's the best practice for the development of gender balance anytime, but especially now at a time where there's so much uncertainty, there's a lot of ambiguity about what's happening, and we constantly need to be updating our understandings of situations. One of the biggest mistakes that we can make is to say, I know the answer now and I'm going to forge forth with that and defend my perspective, rather than having a view to learn as much as I can as a leader. And so this is something that I very strongly recommend for all of you leading your organizations. Another point is, again, a best practice in general, but very important now, is to use our data with purpose. So we want to be paying attention to what we can learn from the new data that are coming in with respect to our people analytics within our organizations, to make sure that we're not missing anything that our data could reveal to us during the disruption and going forward. We may find that there were particular profiles of men or women who were having challenges before the disruption, and now they're a little bit different ones. So we want to be paying attention as we start to get those clues. Also, again, whenever we're leading change within our organizations, we need to have coalitions of support within and across our organizations. And it's interesting because in our normal working lives, for those who typically go to an office every day, we have our sets of regular meetings with people and our conversations with people regularly. And now we almost have a privilege of being more intentional about who we're talking to and setting up intentional conversations with people that we want to be getting on board for the change that we're striving towards. So I wanted to make sure that folks were paying attention to that. both within and across organizations. So it's important to leverage, if you know the champions in other organizations within your alumni group, for example, then connecting with them and learning from each other and trying the things that are working for each other can be very beneficial. And then we also, of course, need the coalition within our organization to actually make the change happen there. So we have the group of people who are all pushing in the same direction. And then finally, I wanted to remind us of leadership. Introduction to leadership is the importance of a motivating vision. And we can start to feel a bit sort of overwhelmed or concerned about how bad things are now. And it's critically important that we keep in mind this vision of how the disruption can help us to move to a better place. So to the extent that you start to think about that and start to articulate it and share it with others can also be very beneficial. And with that, I think I've talked long enough without interruption. So I'd like to open it up for more conversation.
Absolutely. And I think that last slide was fantastic because it answers a few of the questions that are being asked. And given your expertise as both in leadership and in gender balance, having those clear checkpoint of some of the things that we can do and that we can encourage business leaders and business managers to do is really great. Now, before we ask any more questions, given that we are more than halfway through the time, I'd like to just bring Derek in now also into the discussion, and then Derek can help us answer some of the questions so that we don't have Zoe talking too much. I can see that you need your glass of water right now, Zoe. Okay, so wonderful. So Derek, I'm going to start off by asking you a couple questions, and then we'll let the audience come in with some of their questions too. And I'll take questions for Zoe and you both as we go along. So my first sort of starting salvo to you, Derek, is you're clearly a champion for gender diversity. You've been a champion for us at the INSEAD Gender Initiative. So as a male leader, what motivates you? Where is this passion and commitment to sort of make sure that we advance gender balance in companies, in society? Where does this come from?
Thank you, Vinica, and Zoe, thank you so much for having me today in this discussion, this conversation. It was great to hear the findings of the survey, Zoe, and lots of the conclusions you make sound very real. Just to frame my answer, I'm basically answering you as a business leader from the retail sector, where we have about half female and male employees, and all the things you mentioned sounded very familiar and sounded very reflected, found reflection in me. There's a few points that we find ourselves on a daily basis observing. One of those points is that, in fact, the issue of gender balance is going through different phases. So we noticed that when we were listening to our colleagues during the full lockdown phase, their needs were different as they are now, which is what I call phase 2. So, they're back to work and the kids are still at home entirely or partially. And suddenly when we listen to them, the needs become different. And the third phase that we still haven't reached here, at least in Belgium where we are, is when kids will be back to school and parents will be back to work. The interesting thing is that the lockdown phase on which we focused so much was here 8 weeks. But now we're in this middle phase where the kids are still home and the parents are supposed to work, and that is going to be 14 weeks. So that's a lot longer actually than the lockdown. So as leaders, I would very much want to encourage you to focus on this second phase because it's a more difficult phase. A second observation that's come through listening to the employees was to say, hey, there seems to be a different answer for some of our employees. And it turned out that there was a quite different answer from monoparental families and biparental families. And what I mean is the following. I did some work on that afterwards. And in my country, in Belgium, about 27% of families are monoparental families, which is 1 out of 4. And the other 3/4 are biparental families. And it turns out that of these monoparental families, more than 80% are women. So that's moms, single moms with children. And if you combine those two, I'd really like to just make sure that we all understand that in this middle phase, where children are still at home and parents are supposed to work, when we're talking single parent families, that is a very crunchy situation. I recognize lots of the messages you send in the phase of total lockdown. It was a lot about flexibility, the possibilities and the limitations. At this stage, when it's about returning to work, we do get a lot of questions around childcare and youth care. And, you know, am I allowed to bring the kids to the store? Can I actually bring the PC to the store and do the homeschooling while I'm at work? Is that possible? So yes, I recognized a lot of what you said, Zoe, and also in the business we are in, we feel that the efforts we have previously done in terms of establishing gender balance, and that's, Vinica, also where my passion comes from, you're actually trying to reach gender balance, and oh God, this COVID situation has put you right in front of where you were, because we hear a lot of emotions about it, but they're well framed within how relations in the organization in terms of gender balance were actually evolving. And the last observation is what I loved about your learning point. It's quite amazing since we have stores. This is retail, book retail, cultural products. We do have in some of our stores reading corners. And it's amazing how our own employees have converted those reading corners in, can I call it, childcare corners, homeschooling corners. And as a leader, naturally, we've completely supported that. And so being an organization that is open for learning is tremendously useful in this period.
Thank you, that's great. And in fact, you know, clearly the aspect of your being a male leader is having an impact with our listeners. We're getting questions on how you as a business manager, as a male champion, how are you able to recruit more male leaders to join the cause, to support this? And we have a couple of questions on this line of thought.
Well, basically in daily life, employees, colleagues are colleagues. I mean, we're in this together, we are working together, we're leading together, we're parenting together. I would say that at the start, this is a joint project, balanced leadership. Now, practically spoken, Vinica, what happens is that during the COVID, in this phase one, I found myself talking to the managing director, and we were saying, well, maybe we should more than normal talk about the necessity for flexibility. There was a whole debate around, you know, do we do these Zoom meetings at what time of the day during the full lockdown? And it took me a special communication to male colleagues to make absolutely sure to my male colleagues and store managers to tell them, look, these are difficult times. Let's all be aware that, you know, there is people at home, you know, so I had a direct message to my male colleagues, you know, talking to them about it. There was at the same time a special attention point, not during the full lockdown, but now when it came to our female employees, our managing director has a special eye on who's returning to work and who's actually not returning to work, specifically for our female colleagues. Because we are here on the receiving end, it's very difficult, because when one of our female store managers decided not to show up and use a government program that allows her to stay home, you know, as a business leader, who are you to ask the question, why didn't you come back? Because you are a little bit interfering in very private decisions. On the other hand, we've especially focused on our female colleagues and male colleagues, also young families. We've really approached them saying, look, there can be no excuse. You please come back to work and do bring the children. And all the message is absolutely neutral. We do realize that the message is, you know, we have to a little bit serve it in a slightly different way, but both parents, male and female. And here is the surprising piece of news. Again, it's the result of previous work. we've had actually a few men who stepped forward, store managers who stepped forward as fathers, who have said, can I bring my children to the store? Which was fantastic. On the other hand, I think about 4 out of 5 of our female employees were just very, very grateful to be able to become back. And one of them, who's a single mom, saw it as quintessential for her survival, honestly. So how do I recruit men? It's not about recruitment. It's about doing it all together in a very natural way, working together, parenting together, and leading together.
Great, thank you. And you've answered a couple of other questions about how men can support their spouses and colleagues, which you have already answered. Zoe, we're getting some questions in response to your, the last slide in terms of checklists and what should be happening at this point in time. I think you mentioned, the need to build coalitions, the need to constantly have those conversations around that. And an interesting question on networking. On what is happening now to the networking abilities of women, given that, and I quote the question, women were already holding back from networking before COVID. Now, if they're at home, will they do this even less? And what impact will this then have on their being able to build the kinds of coalitions that, as you mentioned, are so important?
So it's a very insightful question, and it's quite early for us to be able to speak to precisely how the disruption is impacting women's networks. But what you're asking does suggest for us that we should be paying attention to this as business leaders, male and female business leaders, and also for our female leaders and aspiring leaders, because we know that women tend to have, on average, less rich networks than men. But the impact of the disruption could play either way. So to the extent that we now don't have those natural opportunities to connect with each other in person, that could make things harder for women, and particularly in the situations like those that Dirk was just suggesting. And we might ask him for input on this as well, given what he's observing being back to work. Since Belgium is a step ahead of us here in Singapore, he may have observed more. But the other thing that I want to say on this before passing to him is that we also have the opportunity to be thoughtful about our networking and to be thoughtful about how we are enabling networking opportunities for our employees. So this is something that I'm actually doing in my role as the OB area chair here at INSEAD. So we have 2 campuses, very diverse faculty within the OB area. And we realized quite early in the disruption, when people started working at home in France, it was a little bit before here in Singapore, that we needed to be connecting with each other. We didn't have those natural coffee chats. We weren't in a room together for all of our meetings, and we needed those opportunities to connect informally. And so we set up some coffee chats, and they're in the morning in France, in the afternoon in Singapore. So it's sort of a reasonable time for people to take a break and connect informally. And this is a way that we've created a system in which people will do that networking that they would normally be doing in the corridors. And what's interesting is we've seen that people who maybe wouldn't naturally walk by each other's office and seek each other out are also having opportunities to interact. So I think both as individuals creating opportunities for ourselves, and also as leaders of teams or organizations, to figure out what are the ways that we can help people in general to be connecting in a human way during the disruption. And then also beyond that, it can help our women and potentially other members of marginalized groups that might be less likely to naturally go knock on the door of their colleagues to connect with them. Would you like to say anything on this, Dirk, though, too?
Thank you, Zoe. Definitely. In this COVID-19, networking has been a challenge. And I can only respond to that as a mentor of some female promising mentees. The networking, it's clear that a number of people are very, very busy. Lots of key people that I want them to meet are actually busy ensuring that their business gets through this crisis. And so there is a trade-off to be made. between helping them connect and respecting in your network the priorities of the people you want them to meet. So it's just a little harder work than normal, more thoughtful about it. It's scarce resource, but as a mentor, I would definitely focus on identifying for your mentee in these time-tight moments, the A, priority network building activities you would require your mentee to do, and two, put it in a measurable goal. Because there is another time-squeezed moments. I'm supposed to meet that person, but it's so difficult. Well, put yourself a deadline. Make sure you call the person, and time or no time, do it. So my reaction as a mentor is, hey, yes, agree, more focus, and just make it happen and put yourself a goal. Don't give in to time pressure limitations.
It's very interesting. And, you know, you've talked about mentoring, and we've had questions about mentoring. We've had a number of questions about remote working. And there's an interesting question that actually combines these two. So let me address that to both of you. Before COVID, some men were saying that they did not want to be physically alone in an office with a woman. With remote working, it seems that this perceived barrier to mentoring would be removed. Your comments on this?
Well, this is like a very strange question to me in terms of, you know, I cannot identify very well with the question, honestly. I think mentoring is all a question of values and you know, making it happen in the right way. By the way, I have been, as a mentor, helping a mentee who in a virtual situation had complained about not very correct behavior in terms of receiving WhatsApp messages that were too bullying in her terms, whilst she had met that person also in the physical world, and it was less happening. So I don't think we should automatically think that the virtual world leads to a different behavior. Unfortunately, when people are not positively intentioned, Vinica, you know, virtual, physical, it will remain a difficult task to handle. And my advice is always very straightforward. Whenever there is a feeling of uncomfortableness, stand up and make yourself heard on day one. That's the only advice I can give, virtual or physical. But yeah, it may happen, but for me, it's off the table as such by the thought of it. Huh?
Okay, indeed. I mean, some things don't change irrespective of whether we're working physically together or remotely. It can happen anyway. Absolutely, point well taken. Now, there are questions around, again, continuing on the theme of remote working, about how to convey that working from home does not mean disengaged. You know, how can, I guess this applies to men as well as to women, but especially in the context of gender balance, how do we make sure that this does not take away from the perceived involvement of women in their careers and in their professions? Zoe, any comments from you on this?
So the first thing that I'd like to share is that if we're in a context beyond the lockdowns in various countries where there is some choice involved, then ideally there is some FaceTime at work and some home working. It's much harder to be working entirely remotely when other members of the team are working entirely in the office, and to not have it feel that you're apart from. I mean, that kind of is a setup for marginalization. So I would avoid those types of hard and fast, in or out types of decisions with respect to remote working. We have a lovely example of how this has been done within a UK professional services firm. This is a colleague of mine who works on gender balance at London Business School. And what he found in this research was that allowing people, and this was pre-disruption even, having knowledge workers determine how often they would like to work at home. So you don't have to come into the office every day. We will be evaluating on the same output that we normally do, but you have an option to work at home on a discretionary basis. Everybody was given this. no one didn't come to office at all. Most people came in 3 or 4 days a week, and both male and female employees were equally happy with the setup. They felt that they were able to work productively. Their performance was maintained, if not slightly improved. But what's fascinating about this is that it disproportionately helped the working mothers. So everybody's given the option. It wasn't the case that because I think in our minds we can assume if we do this, the working mothers will just stay home and everyone else will work in the office all the time. And the data suggests that it's actually much more balanced in how people use that option. And then also the exciting part from this is that the group that we're most concerned about, particularly with the disruption now, was disproportionately benefiting. So I think the flexible, discretionary flexible work is the best organizational solution.
Excellent. Okay, and now let's move a little bit away from corporate leaders to political leaders. And Zoe, this is one of your favorites, so I have to ask you this question. I know she's someone you're very influenced by. People are noticing the success of women leaders like Jacinda. How can we talk about male and female leadership styles without giving in to stereotypes? Very interesting question.
No, it's a great question. And I love that you brought her up. And I also appreciate this opportunity to celebrate her. I was telling Vinica more privately recently that I was using her in my leadership teaching materials before anybody else knew who she was, and now everybody's celebrating her. So silver lining to the current disruption. I'm a huge fan. But the question is also a serious one beyond this excitement about getting to talk about her. And it is quite a delicate line between saying that women are good leaders and men are not, which is something that I have heard bounced around a little bit, to be completely honest. And I get quite worried when I hear people talking about those in that type of language. Now, what's very important, and I know that Dirk will have input on this as well, actually, because I feel like I'm stealing his line now with what I'm about to say, is that the question suggests that men and women are categorically different, that men are one type of leader that's masculine and women are a different type of leader that's feminine. And what we know is that both women and men can hold more what we think of as feminine traits as well as what we think of as masculine traits. And so the best way for us to be thinking about this is to, rather than saying men are from Mars and women are from Venus, and Venus is a better type of leader now, we can say that there are characteristics of leadership or styles of leadership that we tend to associate with femininity. And there are approaches to leadership or styles of leadership that we tend to associate with men. And so they have this more feminine or masculine approach. And that it's important for us to be able to leverage both sides of those to be effective leaders now as well as at any time. Did you want to add anything onto that, Dirk, or did I say everything you would have said?
No, fantastic. I'm smiling here, Zoe, because you can't say it better. I'm going to add a point that you mentioned yourself. I think that this COVID situation as a leader, let's face it, we've never gone through this. So even in terms of management characteristics, if there is one that I would pull out, or a few that I would pull out, you've mentioned one, is an enormous willingness to learn, because you simply know you don't have the answer. It's not been there before. And when you talk learning, it's very much about how you as a person learn. And you know, humbleness when you're learning is a starting point. And so I've been very observative, as we are, all of us, and you know, humbleness and being willing to learn and take the right decision based on good advice, you know, very widespread input is actually what seems to be somewhat bringing the right solution. And, you know, it's not necessarily a man or a woman. I think it's a certain way of recognizing that this is never lived before, and you'd better be a very good learner.
Thank you both for that. Derek, a very specific question to you now. Does your company include gender balance in managerial evaluations and performance metrics? You started to speak about this, so they want a little bit more information.
So here is, we are a small company. We are like 60 employees in total in retail. It's a cultural product. And the one of the big things we have, these are bookstores. And what happens in bookstores is that the common denominator is cultural passion. And actually we have no difference whatsoever in terms of gender when we do evaluations. It's very much driven by passion for the culture world. And so I would say in our own evaluation system, I think there is none of that actually related to gender. They're all about the passion for the product. A lot of them, customer service. And our managing director is somebody who's absolutely, I'm chair of the board. The managing director is telling me, look, we're 50-50. I think we've got 40% of the store managers are women. So actually we're all joined by a passion that makes us a little bit even forget about gender. Let me be honest about that.
Okay. Now the questions are still coming in fast and furious, but I'm conscious that we're almost out of time, and I want to leave at least a couple minutes for each of you to share, your sort of final message with our audience today. So let's just dive right into that. If I could ask you to just quickly, in a couple minutes each, just what do you think is the most important thing you want to leave our listeners with respect to gender balance and COVID-19?
So I'll go first so we can have the closing remarks. For me, this has been a period where, as a leader, chair of a board, we've never as before been put in front of our responsibilities in terms of societal impact. And gender equality, SDG 5, is so much part of that. So as before the COVID crisis, with my personal passion for the Sustainable Development Goals, I was driving in fourth gear the car, the COVID has made us change to third gear because suddenly it was an unknown world and you were being tested on what you stood for. I can only encourage all of our colleagues who are on this call to take up their role as leaders and go to fifth gear when it comes to putting these sustainable development goals at the core of your purpose of your organization. And if you do that, please do include SDG 5.
So I don't know that I can close us off in a stronger way than that. I agree wholeheartedly with what Dirk was just sharing. It's so important, and I love that metaphor for how we should be leading. The other piece that I will add to this is to keep in mind that really all of our best leadership practices are what we need to be doing now. This connects with the concern for the societal well-being. This comes into play with respect to our concern for our employees, and really thinking about the society that we want to build, the organization that we want to build, because we are all in the process of creating the new normal. It's not here yet. And so just bearing in mind that what we're doing today and what we do in the next 6 months, the next year, will be it will have a disproportionate impact on the future that we're all living in for some time. So I do encourage you to stay close to your values, work on take time for the empathy, for the human connection, and bring all of us to bring our leadership A games to the fore, particularly now. And I think that's it for me. Thank you all for coming so much. And these have been such rich questions. Another thanks for everyone who completed the survey earlier. You gave us wonderful insights, and we very much appreciate you sharing with us in both of these ways.
Thank you so much, Zoe and Dirk. And I want to say in closing, on behalf of the INSEAD Gender Initiative, that we do believe that this COVID-19 disruption does not have to impede the hard-earned progress towards gender balance. As with every crisis, there is an opportunity here to minimize the negatives and leverage the crisis to society's benefits. And I think we can all do this very effectively with the advice that we've had today from both of our speakers. Zoe, Derek, thank you so much for some really insightful and candid observations. And I also want to thank the audience for some wonderful questions. I mean, I wish we could take them all because you've asked so many really relevant ones. But thank you all for being here. Thank you to our speakers and thank you to the audience.